This is Breaking the News Plus on this Wednesday evening. Tonight, I want to talk about an issue that has really divided people over the last several days since the announcement was made by Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty that her office was not going to take up anything that comes from a pretextual stop. Now, I know a lot of those words can seem confusing, so we'll get into that, but we'll do so with my guest, Dr. Yahuru Williams with the University of St. Thomas. Dr. Williams, you and I have talked about politics and race and law many, many times over the years. Thanks for coming on tonight.
My pleasure. Good to see you, Jenna.
So I brought you on tonight because you just wrote an opinion piece in the Star Tribune, and it's titled, Mary Moriarty Got It Right. Pretext Stops Are Biased and Ineffective. And that stems from her decision to do what? Why don't you just explain that out of the gate?
Well, what Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty has decided to do is stop prosecuting these low-level pretext stops. And these are stops that are not conditioned or warranted by officers' knowledge of a crime, but suspicions about the potential based on factors that have nothing to do with the behavior of the driver. And so they can be pretext stops that are for broken taillights, for example, or other things that aren't major crimes, but that ultimately, particularly in Black and brown communities, are the source of a lot of consternation around issues of racial bias and racial profiling. These are the types of stops. And in my article, I talk about the controversial and tragic killing of Philando Castile, where he was stopped by officers on that day simply because he fit the profile in the officer's mind of a criminal person, a person engaged in criminal activity. And it's that type of bias and those types of stops that Mary Moriarty was seeking to root out in this decision by Hennepin County.
And it's, to be fair, let's note, because I've been here a long time, Ramsey County started doing this several years ago. I don't know that it met as much of a fiery criticism online as what Ms. Moriarty is going through right now. But Ramsey County, John Choi, decided to do the same thing, I think in 2021. And let's talk about the results Ramsey County saw. Can you talk about that?
They were phenomenal. In fact, what Ramsey County saw, what John Choi was very courageous in making that decision. Of course, he was making it in a very different moment. And so this was post the murder of George Floyd. There was a great deal of conversation around police reform and how do we make traffic stops in particular safer? How do we better marshal the resources of police to deal with real serious crime and not these low-level violations? And how do we root out some of the bias and some of the complaints that were coming from community around pretext stops, and which were basically amounted to Black and brown people as harassment, forms of harassment. So John Choi took a look at this, looked at some of the things that were happening in other parts of the country, Philadelphia most notably, and some other communities that instituted similar reforms and believed that they could have the same benefit here in Ramsey County. They implemented it, and the numbers have borne that out. And so we haven't seen diminished productivity in terms of police. We haven't seen, what we have seen are less complaints around this type of harassment. And certainly when Mary Moriarty made the courageous decision to push this forward in Hennepin County, it was with the knowledge that this has been very successful in Ramsey County, very successful.
Yeah, I think you noted in your op-ed some numbers from Ramsey County. The stops fell by 86% after this, a 66% drop in the number of stops of Black drivers, and the number of firearms confiscated in that time just remained the same. So showing that the pretext stops stopped, but they still were able to recover firearms and find criminals in other ways rather than just this type of thing. Now, Dr. Williams, it's not lost on anybody watching this conversation that you are a Black man. And so the skeptic watching saying, oh, there's a Black man saying that this is only happening to Black and brown people, but the data bears out that that's who it happens to at a pretty high rate, correct?
Absolutely. And it's been my own experience, Jana. Unfortunately, I wrote or talked a couple of years ago about being stopped in New Jersey on what was effectively a pretext stop. This is a wound that communities of color, persons in community of color know intimately. And when you look at the data and you realize that, in fact, it doesn't make communities safer, that it's an irritant, that it's a pernicious form of racial bias, and that you have people like John Choi and Mary Morty willing to look at the data and make data informed decisions about policy reforms that make us all safer. I think that all adds up to what unfortunately amounts to a controversial, but actually a courageous and a very smart decision for Hennepin County.
Yeah, there have been other counties' attorney and other members of law enforcement, including the Hennepin County Sheriff, Dawana Witt, who is also African American, saying what Mary Moriarty has chosen to do is a problem. This is bad. It makes crime worse. How do you argue against that when you have a sheriff saying that, who is also African American?
I'm a big fan of Dawana Witt. I have a great deal of respect for Dawana Witt and for others in law enforcement. I think in this particular instance, though, and particularly given the context of this uptick in violent crime in Minneapolis, it's a moment where people are focused on this as what they perceive as a very effective means of preventing crime. But when you look at the data, and why do we have access to data? So we can make better data informed decisions. The data simply doesn't bear out what they're sharing. I understand that why law enforcement would see this as the continued use of these pretext stops is effective, because it at least gives them the opportunity to think about how those pretext stops might reduce crime, particularly in moments when people are calling for more officers and greater response times and so on and so forth. So how do we deal with crime? But when it's wrong, and when there's no evidence to bear out that that's ultimately been successful in reducing the level of crime, then you really have to have leaders in community, leaders in government who make data-informed decisions. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I wish more people were familiar with the data from Ramsey County. I think if more people here in the Twin Cities in particular were familiar with the success that John Choi's office has had, they'd be less concerned and actually kind of leaning into Mary Moriarty saying, this is right now a good decision for our community. And with the recent memory of two controversial stops. So we think about Philando Castile, of course, but we also think about the killing, of Dante Wright,
Yeah.
And so those are two very controversial killings that could have been avoided. And they would have made the community any less safe as a result of pursuing a different policy in those cases.
Yeah, and what you mean by that with Mr. Wright and Mr. Castile is if the stop had never happened, not the stuff that came after, if the stop that never happened. We don't have that
Exactly.
result.
And there were other ways for the police in those particular cases to, if there were questions, to pursue their suspicions about those drivers that didn't involve those controversial stops. But ultimately, again, if we look at the numbers and if we look at the data, African Americans, people of color, 6.5 more times more likely to be stopped using pretext justification. The fact that often these end in encounters where these individuals are subjected to police violence, the loss of confidence in police as a result of this, the loss of police productivity around these pretext stops. I think all these are things that justify the decision that Hennepin County Attorney Mary Morty made last week. And again, I understand, particularly now, given the uptick in crime in Minneapolis, how people are feeling about this, but it doesn't change the data. And I wish people would lean into the data and recognize that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, the Department of Justice, who shared those statistics, if you look at the numbers, they're not wrong. This isn't making us safer. This change makes us safer.
Right. In conversations, through conversation, we can have opinion and debate, but data is data. You know, numbers are numbers. And you mentioned some of it, so I want to give our viewers a chance to hear some of that data. You mentioned the U.S. Department of Justice and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. They have that data because they studied the Minneapolis Police Department. Black drivers were 6.5 more times more likely to be stopped for minor infractions, 1.5 more likely to get a citation, 12.8 times more likely to have their vehicle searched, 9 times more likely to suffer violence at the hands of police. So those numbers are trending in the wrong direction, and it begins with what we're talking about as a pretext stop.
Absolutely. And those numbers are staggering when you consider, Jana, that's all unavoidable. That, again, these pretext stops are based on, in many instances, racial bias. I think the Philando Castile case is not an anomaly. He was stopped, as I mentioned in the article, the officers admitted later, for having a broad nose. So this was the, he fit the description or some kind of, of an imaginary criminal. And when you have policing practices like that, they are corrosive to community in three very substantive ways. They erode trust in the officers within communities that particularly are over policed and underprotected, Black and Brown communities. Number two, they really take away from police resources which can be allocated in other ways that can make all of us more safe. And number three, they place a burden on officers in some sense, to criminalize elements within the community, or to think about this in terms of, instead of a holistic model of public safety, numbers, generating numbers, generating arrests, generating citations, so on and so forth. That's not what public safety is all about. Public safety should be about, these kind of broader issues that ultimately make everyone in community feel safer.
You bring up a point, and I know you never shy away when I ask you, person to person kind of stuff. So I'll just ask you. I can say, as a 48-year-old white person, I have never been stopped in a pretextual stop. You tell me, as a Black man, you have. And I need to listen to your experience, and you've heard mine. And so our experiences actually bore out in the data, right?
Absolutely. And I appreciate that, Jana, because often we say wounds produce narratives. And when we don't listen to the wound that people have suffered in community, and when we're not kind of dialed into what it means to have been the victim, and I use that language deliberately, it does feel like a violation of your civil rights, of your humanity, to be pulled over and to be questioned or interrogated simply because of the color of your skin. And when we're talking about low-level offenses here, and some of those pretexts that are used for the stops, it makes it worse, because what it does is promote this view that somehow communities of color warrant that suspicion. If we're ever going to move toward a larger society and culture, where we value the dignity of all people, we certainly can't have this as one of the tools that officers use in policing our communities.
Can you say, just this, my last question then, Dr. Williams, when you had been pulled over for a stop like this, there is an adult person knows when they are being treated as suspicious. Is that what it felt like to you? Like you were a suspect in something and you were just driving your car?
Absolutely. The last time it happened to me, Jane, I was actually traveling to receive an award from my alma mater as a distinguished alumni in New Jersey, and I was pulled over for going too slow. And when I engaged with the officer, he asked me a series of questions. Where were my bags? I told him I was going to a reunion. He says, "Where are your bags?" And I said, "They're in the trunk." My wife was in the car. He said to her, "Who's she?" So some of the things that we saw in the Minnesota Department of Human Rights report in Minneapolis around honorific. So treating me with a lack of dignity, not giving me the asking me to explain things that, had nothing to do with why he was pulling me over. And then ultimately letting me go with a citation, a warning about driving too slow at 9:30 in the morning on a not busy highway. And this is an experience, again, that I think is replicated that you can find in conversations with communities of color, where people will share with you that this has been their experience. And this is really what I think Mary Moriarty, John Choi were trying to get at. There are better ways that officers can spend their time. If you look at the numbers, you realize that, again, as I indicated in the article, and I would encourage people to read that and to read the data that Mary Moriarty shared and to look at the data coming out of Ramsey County as well. It hasn't made those communities less safe. It has increased trust in community. And that's really important right now.
Dr. Williams, I appreciate your time, your intellect, and sharing your own personal experience with me tonight.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care. That's all for Breaking the News Plus on this Wednesday night. We'll see you next time.